Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Fred Tung. I am the Associate Dean for Equity, Justice, and Engagement, and I'm pleased to welcome all of you to this talk by Professor Meera E. Meera is the Honorable Vano Spencer Professor of Law at Southwestern Law School. She's a national expert on legal education, racial representation, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. She's also the director of the Law School Survey of Student Engagement, which houses the largest repository of law student data and is based at Indiana University, Bloomington. Before joining Southwestern, she was a tenured professor of law at Thomas Jefferson School of Law in San Diego. Professor Deo has also held previous visiting positions at Berkeley Law, UC Irvine School of Law, UCLA School of Law, UC Davis School of Law, and New College of Florida. She teaches civil procedure, evidence, law and society, and race and law. Her research utilizes empirical methods to interrogate institutional diversity, affirmative action, and critical race theory. Professor Deo's scholarship has been widely published in law reviews and peer-reviewed journals and cited in numerous amicus briefs filed in the U.S. Supreme Court. In 2020, she was elected to the American Law Institute. And with that, please join me in welcoming Professor Meera E.
Thank you so much. I am excited to be here with you. This is, as I mentioned to a couple of you earlier, my first work trip in 2 years, so I'm thrilled that I can be here with all of you. I know, clapping for us all. So I'm really excited to be here to share some of my original empirical research with you. I'm especially grateful to Dean Unwachi-Willig, Bridget Carney, and Professor Fred Tung. Thank you for that introduction as well. And also to the students in Dean Unwachi-Willig's Critical Race Theory seminar who shared response papers and questions with me beforehand, which I have actually incorporated throughout the presentation. I know we might have some time afterwards to talk more informally as well. So it's especially exciting, of course, to be here today on this third day of hearings on Supreme Court Justice nominee Ketanji Brown Jackson, which I'm sure will result in a historic outcome for all of us. So let's see, I'm presenting findings today on a few different sources. I'll share national, longitudinal, quantitative data on law students that's collected through the Law School Survey of Student Engagement, or LESI. And I'm also presenting findings from my book, Unequal Profession, Race and Gender in Legal Academia, which was published by Stanford University Press in 2019. These will set the stage for a couple other sets of data that I've collected during COVID. So first, the Pandemic Effects on Legal Academia study, which examines law faculty challenges throughout the pandemic, and also some ongoing LESI data. So that sort of sets the stage, but you heard that I teach Civ Pro and evidence, so I'm sure you're not surprised I have kind of an outline, right, of what our time will be like. So here's just a brief set of ideas for what I'm hoping to cover in my 25 or 30 minutes of presentation time. I'll start with some baseline findings. And so this is what we knew both from LESI and from Unequal Profession about particular challenges that were facing students as well as faculty with regard to issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion in particular. And then we'll move to think more specifically about inequities that have been heightened due to COVID. So again, we have challenges from before the pandemic, and then we can talk about the ways in which the pandemic has intensified or exacerbated those challenges, again, both for law students as well as for law faculty. I will spend a little time talking about solutions, and that might jumpstart a broader conversation during our Q&A and discussion. All right, so before we get to the actual data on law students and law faculty about diversity, equity, and inclusion, about pandemic challenges and ongoing challenges, we can sort of take it back a step to think about kind of a foundational question. Why does diversity matter? Does it matter at all? We have actually plenty of research documenting the different ways in which exposure to diversity improves students' critical thinking. increases overall satisfaction rates with law school, and enhances leadership skills. So when we have diversity, not just in a classroom among the students who are sitting together, but even among the people at the podium in the front of the classroom, or sitting together in a seminar perhaps, and facilitating or leading those conversations, opportunities for exposure to new ideas expand. They just increase even further. Equity and inclusion, of course, go beyond the numbers. So usually when we think about diversity, I think of that as sort of a numerical concept, right? What are the numbers of people from whatever identity background? As we know, it's not just a question, though, of how many students of color are in a classroom, or the percentage or the number of first-gen students on campus, or whether the numbers or the percentages of LGBTQ faculty has increased in recent years. Again, these are all sort of questions of diversity in terms of the numbers. The qualitative experience, though, of course, matters as well. And this is one thing that I love about the data that I'm sharing with you today. It's both quantitative and qualitative. And so we rely on both survey data from LESI, as well as interview and survey data that I've collected from law faculty members. So some of you probably are familiar with LESI already. Again, this is the Law School Survey of Student Engagement. I see a number of you nodding. So LESI conducts an annual survey in partnership with law schools throughout the United States and Canada. We ask about everything from time usage to the quality and frequency of interactions with faculty, staff, and classmates. And then we publish that data in a number of different venues. We have our own blog posts, we produce an annual report, and we also share the data. So we give the individual schools that participate all of their own data so that they can better understand and to respond to their own students' needs. And then we collect all the data together in an aggregate form, and then we share that data with really anyone who's interested. So I've been involved with a student at Harvard who I met because I had made a presentation to her class on a different project, and she's been very excited about using LESI data. And so we've had probably 6 back and forths now about, well, what questions and how do we frame them, and what exactly do you want disaggregated? So if any of you are interested in LESI data, I'd be happy to work with you, either to share the raw data with you if you know how to analyze your own results, or if you want us to do some of that analysis for you, we're happy to do that for you as well. Our methods are relatively straightforward. We collect and report on primarily national aggregate survey data using these quantitative methods. So annual reports, I should just mention, are very different from academic articles. They don't engage in the literature for the most part. They don't create or start with a general framework in terms of the theory. They really just focus on data about law student experiences surrounding whatever particular theme me and my team have selected for that particular year. Some of our results draw from the main survey, which includes over 10,000 students at over 70 schools most years. Sometimes we focus on what we call topical survey modules, and so these are a small set of questions around a particular theme or topic that invite participation from a smaller number of schools. So when we have those smaller numbers of schools participating for a particular theme or topic, we can't always disaggregate along all of the lines we've liked because we don't have enough numbers or we don't want to compromise anonymity. And so we can't always talk about both race and gender for Native American students, for example, much to my disappointment, or sometimes we can't disaggregate by sexual orientation. So these are some of the challenges in terms of the methods that we're facing. All right, so I want to spend just a moment on our 2020 annual report, which I maybe provocatively titled Diversity and Exclusion. We found significant differences in the ways in which students view diversity efforts on their campus based in part on their own privilege, not only based on race and ethnicity, but also gender, first-gen status, sexual orientation, debt levels, and in other ways. So it turns out that privileged students tend to be relatively satisfied with diversity efforts on campus, but more vulnerable students see those efforts as falling short. All right, so what do I mean by that? While roughly 1/3 of white students see their schools as doing very much to support racial or ethnic diversity on campus, less than 1/4 of Black students think their schools are doing very little in this regard. A full 1/3 of first-gen students and 38% of students with the highest debt levels report that they do not feel valued by their law schools. A full 1 out of every 5, so 21% of law students who are Black, Latinx, or Native American, along with 32% of students whose parents did not finish high school, note that they do not feel comfortable being themselves on campus, compared to just 12% of white students. And finally, only 11% of heterosexual students think their schools do very little around to avoid identity-based stigma on campus, compared to much higher percentages of students who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, and those who identify as another sexual orientation. So again, this is baseline survey data that we collected from law students before COVID. All right, what about for law faculty? So my book, Unequal Profession, Race and Gender in Legal Academia, provides a similar baseline for understanding challenges in the law faculty context. And again, this is before COVID-19. The project revealed a number of barriers that are especially salient today, not only for women of color, but for other non-traditional and less secure faculty members. So here are a few of the relevant findings that we'll come back to talk about in terms of how they've been exacerbated during COVID. Women from all backgrounds report carrying extra service burdens on campus. Many women of color are particularly overloaded with student obligations because students tend to see these faculty members as more available, more accessible, and more responsive to their needs. The vast majority of women of color in my previous project worried about how this extra time they spent on service might affect their professional trajectory, especially because they had less time to devote to scholarship. And finally, women from all backgrounds are more likely to be the default parent at home. So this is the person who's not only spending more individual time on childcare, but also is carrying the mental load. So remembering which snow boots have been outgrown, or who's arranging the play date, or when you're gonna go to the doctor's office. All right, so we know that these are all some of the barriers that have been facing law students of color, and other marginalized students, as well as women of color law professors from pre-pandemic times. We can turn then to consider the ways in which vulnerable populations have navigated the heightened stressors due to COVID. Now, I know we're all well aware that things have been much more difficult in a variety of areas since March 2020. So here I'm going to share some findings from our 2021 LESI annual report, The COVID Crisis in Legal Education, as well as those from my ongoing study, Pandemic Effects on Legal Academia, including data that I share in my Pandemic Pressures on Faculty essay that's forthcoming in Pennsylvania Law Review online. All right, so first our LESI report reveals that students struggle to meet their basic needs. 63% of students worried about paying their bills, 29% were concerned about eviction or housing loss, and 43% faced food insecurity, including 50% of all student of color respondents. And so this is, these are students who told us directly that they were more worried during COVID about whether they had enough food to eat. This goes beyond, of course, race and ethnicity to other vulnerable populations among law students as well. 1 in 5 first-gen students said that COVID interfered very much with their ability to pay for law school or some other related living expenses, compared to only 11% of students who have at least one parent with a college degree. Debt burdens also correlate with concerns about paying for law school and living expenses, so you can see the increase is happening virtually in lockstep. 10% of students who expect to graduate debt-free noted that COVID interfered quite a bit or very much with their ability to pay, and then it jumps to 26% for those with $100,000 to $100,000 in debt, and then all the way up to 40% for those who expect to graduate with over $100,000 in educational loans. So given these struggles regarding food and housing and financial security, a declining quality of life overall, it's not surprising that the vast majority of students in the LESI survey faced challenges, mental health challenges as well. So 85% noted that they suffered with depression that interfered with their daily functioning. 87% talked about anxiety that interfered with their daily functioning. And as you can see from the smaller circles next to the large ones, both of these findings had marked gender effects as well. So in response to a student question specifically about COVID effects, when we consider all of the other challenges happening, George Floyd's murder, increasing hate crimes against Asian Americans, the fraught election, Capitol insurrection, family separation, and more, the numbers may be even higher, right? So again, this was a question directly about the ways in which COVID has interfered with daily functioning. Unsurprisingly, academic success took a big hit due to COVID, especially for students of color, and again, more for women students than for men. A full 79% of students shared that COVID-19 interfered with their ability to succeed as a student. 3/4 of all men were affected, compared to a whopping 82% of women who completed our survey. In addition to gender disparities, as you can see, there are significant racial disparities as well. Now, remarkably, to me, for sure, 78% of students in our 2021 LESI survey rated their law school experience overall as good or even excellent. In large part, I think this is due to faculty support. So a few students actually asked about this directly, and certainly we noted the disparity as well. I've included the other years of law school satisfaction, so you can see there is a slight drop-off, but not necessarily one that's quite as dramatic as we might expect to see, given all of the other challenges that students have been navigating in the past years. So how can students express such high levels of satisfaction despite the actual challenges? Well, a full 93% of law student respondents appreciated that professors showed them, quote, care and concern during the pandemic. 72% reported positive relationships with faculty members, showing relative consistency again with years past. So there was a slight drop compared to what we've seen in the past, but really nothing compared to what we might have expected to see. Now, of course, the pandemic affected faculty members as well. So for my book project, I collected survey and interview data from almost 100 law professors throughout the United States, using a purposeful sampling technique that highlighted the experiences of women of color faculty members. So looking specifically at that race times gender effect. For that project, as well as for this new project, I use a target sample approach. So you start with a seed group of participants that is diverse among various domains: race, gender, ethnicity, leadership positions, school tier, geography, tenure status, and more. And then that group, once they've participated, nominates others to participate. Now, this is similar to a snowball sample, which many of you are probably familiar with. With snowball sampling, basically everyone who's invited, who's nominated to participate, ends up joining the sample. With target sampling, what's different is that it selects only among those who are nominated to make sure that there is broad representation of the full sample by the end. So this means if I had, let's say, 3 Black women from the East Coast already, then I would only select among those who were nominated other Black women from the West Coast or from the South or from the Midwest, so that not all the Black women were from the same region. I could ensure that I had enough Latinas from top-tier schools as well as more access-oriented schools. I could include people who were deans as well as associate deans, but also assistant professors, and also that Asian American faculty members, for example, were not just East Asian, but also South Asian, Filipino, or from other Asian American backgrounds. So I followed a very similar approach for my pandemic effects on legal academia study. I spoke with 35 law professors during the first year of COVID, so academic year 2020-2021. Every participant completed an online survey through Qualtrics, and then joined me for a one-on-one, in-depth, roughly 60-minute Zoom interview. When my first interviews began, so thinking back to the fall of 2020, if you can remember that time, nobody was vaccinated. I talked with people when we didn't yet know how the virus spread. There were no therapies available. Women were leaving the workforce in droves. Schools and camps were completely shut down. When vaccines became available to those who could find appointments online, when hate crimes were on the rise against Asian Americans, when the US Capitol was stormed by insurrectionists, and so much more. So this is the period of time where I am collecting the data that you'll see now. It was a challenging year for all of us, I think, myself included, and a lot of us have forgotten some of the details. In large part, the PILA study documents those challenges, especially for vulnerable populations, including caregivers, women of color, and untenured faculty. And it also proposes some solutions so that we don't lose even more faculty members to pandemic effects. So we're going to focus on 3 particular themes as we go through this research. The first is prioritizing students. Then we'll move to think about a lack of scholarly productivity. And finally, just as we did for students, we'll talk a little bit about mental health effects. All right, so professors did support students, as we've seen from the LESI data, but that did come at a cost for faculty members, especially women professors, and particularly those from vulnerable populations, including women of color, untenured faculty members, and caregivers. So faculty really have been doing all they can to support students, but they're not always receiving the support they need from others. This means that some faculty members, for example, have shared with me that they've basically become therapists, or they feel like they're pressured to act like a therapist in addition to being professors. Many people told me they had to triage, focusing on just one thing, whatever the immediate thing was that had to get done. For almost everyone, that was teaching. For formal leaders, that was administrative work. And it's worth here noting that the PILA survey data show that over 1/4 of law professors have taken up to a 15% salary reduction since the start of the pandemic. And in addition, over 1/3 are working with decreased or eliminated research funds or stipends, no sabbaticals, research assistants, TAs, or pay for overload teaching, as well as the elimination of some other benefits since March 2020. So a lot of faculty members are asked to do a lot more, but have a lot less with which to do it. Even when you're just focusing on that one thing that was in front of you, this quote was in the book, and I know some of the students focused on this directly, even though it's not on the slide here, but it's this idea that whatever is on fire, or the biggest fire, is what grabs your attention, what you put out first. But even just doing that can be a struggle. One assistant professor in her first year of teaching, who has a toddler at home and no reliable childcare, told me that she is pulling 2 all-nighters every week, and she's just prepping for class. So because her daytime hours are consumed with childcare, she doesn't have any time to focus on scholarship, and of course, that creates a lot of pressure on her as well. So that brings us to our next point. Most professors who participated in the PILA study told me they've had very little time to devote to scholarship. A lot of professors told me this directly. I did not write at all. Some couldn't get in the right headspace, given, of course, that they were preoccupied not only by COVID, but also by police brutality, Black Lives Matter protests, election stress, the Capitol takeover, anti-Asian hate crimes, and the redemption of mass shootings. So again, these were all happening and are continuing to happen simultaneously. Other people told me that they were overwhelmed with other priorities that literally took away their time from the usual summer writing routine. I mean, remember when so many of us were doing this? I don't know, some people might be doing it still, right? But there was a period of time where we just didn't even know how the virus spread. And so summer is usually a time where faculty members are deep into their research, but summer 2020, kids were home from camp, all the schools were closed, daycares were closed, and we were wiping groceries down. Those who did manage to get work done were really creative in their juggling process. Probably the thing that happened the most was giving up sleep. Most people told me that they were sleeping less. Some people were sleeping less because they were trying to get some writing done. Junior scholars, of course, worried so much more about how their lack of productivity would impact promotion, tenure, or contract renewals, knowing how much their institutions value scholarship and being especially worried about their lack of productivity. And like their students, almost every professor reported increased stress, pressure, and anxiety. Which brings us to this topic again of mental health. And this is something that we often don't talk about in legal education and the legal profession, although I'm seeing a little bit of a trend towards recognizing again how important it is to think more about this topic. So every single participant in the PILA study reported elevated stress levels compared to a year ago. Professors are lonely, they are hitting their limits, they are feeling the physical as well as the psychological effects of that stress. A lot of people told me that they lost personal time along with personal space. I'm not including this here, but I have an entire set of findings just on the ways in which there were challenges navigating working from home. And I saw this in many of the students' response papers as well, finding literally space to be able to work or study or even join class. One of my participants, for example, told me, I don't have the bandwidth to work from home. And I was like, do you mean like with your toddler? And she was like, no, I mean my husband is online and we cannot both be online at the same time. So there were also marital troubles that people talked to me about, and intense guilt, actually, especially for parents and particularly for mothers who found themselves not being the kind of parent that they thought they would be, or not the kind of parent who they actually saw themselves as and who they were pre-pandemic. A lot of people had a higher quantity of time, but less quality time. They couldn't be present. They didn't feel engaged. They heard themselves saying no all the time. So they were physically there, but they couldn't actually engage. And one of the most awful things that I noticed as a researcher is how participants had already normalized many of these effects. And of course, all of us have done this to some degree just in order to move on. But in the course of an interview, let's say I'd spend 40 minutes collecting data, talking to somebody about the various challenges in their lives. And at the end, towards the end, I asked everyone a question about personal sacrifices, any personal sacrifices they had made due to COVID. And then so many people just paused and couldn't think of any. And then they'd realize that they'd just talked to me for 40 minutes about the things they'd already been navigating. They realized that they had forgotten. They used to be able to sleep through the night. They used to be able to eat their lunch at a normal time or take a break, go for a run, and otherwise do things to enjoy their lives. So I want to spend my last few minutes on strategies and solutions, first for law students, and then we'll move to talk about law faculty, which another student asked about directly as well. So in terms of conclusions, we know that the COVID report reveals that students have been struggling beyond anything they have collectively experienced before. Many of us, me included, are eager to move on, to put the pandemic behind us, to recognize that it's been a difficult couple years, but celebrate that we can, move forward. But of course, the structural inequalities that had previously created these disparities based on race, ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic status, and other markers exploded due to COVID in legal education, just as they have in other parts of society. And similarly, they will stay with us long after COVID has subsided. So I know it's tempting to think of COVID as this awful relic, right, that we can move past, but I'm encouraging us instead to pause, to dig deeper, to dwell a little bit, even though it's uncomfortable, in the unpleasantness. We have to think more critically about how we may have failed our students, for example, so that we can learn better how to support students going forward. Are food pantries enough? Can we rethink student debt? What's the best way to prioritize mental health? I learned, for example, in your response papers that here at BU, you have drop-in counseling support. Most schools now do offer some sort of free counseling for students. So how can we better support students through mental health? This opportunity to rethink legal education is long overdue. As I write in the report, we cannot preach self-care, but keep assigning the same levels of work that we always have assigned. One student asked me how we can do this better. There are all of these regulations that tell us we have to take roll, we have to assign this many hours of outside of school work for this many hours of in-class time. Well, we can be creative about that, right? So one thing that I do in my assignments is I try to focus on synthesis. It's not just how long will it take to read this many pages and then that's what I need to assign, but going over your outline or creating an outline or other sort of study guides or note cards, all of that can count too as outside of class time. So we can be creative in how we assign that work. Similarly, so many schools around the country in the last couple of years have published anti-racist resolutions focusing on the ways in which they want to be better at promoting issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion on campus. And those statements, I think, are an incredibly useful first step. And then we need to look at what are the next steps. What else have schools been doing to try to put those goals into action? Similarly, we cannot say that we're putting students first, but not devote sufficient resources to actually supporting what our students need. So there's been a lot of destruction due to COVID, but of course, it's also forced us to innovate. There are ways in which we learn to do things, like, within a few days or a week at most schools, somehow becoming experts at online education. I think most of us got better at it over time, but we did find a way to do it when for years, my friends with disabilities had been asking, how can we attend this conference remotely? And it was always said that it was impossible to do. And then quickly it became not just possible, but we recognized the ways in which it really heightens inclusion. So this is an opportunity, I think, for us to rethink the future of legal education, not just for students, but for faculty as well. So one student reminded me to mention that the challenges that we're talking about are not new. The solutions, similarly, have been around for many years. Some of these I share in my book, which was published now 3 years ago, and some of those are challenges and solutions that existed for many, many years before. So there are some old things and new things too. Professors who can afford it have felt like they are subsidizing their own work, paying for extra in-home help or fancy Ethernet cables, or finding other ways to support their own work. Others are fighting to get the accommodations they need, but that is contributing to additional mental health stressors. And to be clear, some are fighting and still denied. So one professor in the PLS study who teaches legal writing said that all legal writing faculty at her institution were required to teach in person. Even medical documentation would not exempt her from being in person because the administration decided the students really wanted in-person learning. And so in her words, she felt that this particular group of faculty were the sacrificial lambs. They were the ones who were going to go into campus even though really nobody felt comfortable going. Many faculty members did not feel supported institutionally. My survey data indicate that only 40% of law faculty felt that their institutions supported them through COVID. And a lot of people that were offered immediate fixes like tenure extensions were concerned that that would not be enough, especially because some of their colleagues delaying a year had no caregiving duties and so were writing more than usual. And that actually was true. There were people who participated in the PLS study who were very clear that they were productive, but also that they were productive specifically because they had a partner who took over all of the caregiving duties in their family, or because they didn't have any caregiving duties and that eased a lot of their burdens. Now, these faculty members were struggling. They were still stressed out. They were worried about elderly relatives. They were still losing sleep, but they were able to be much more productive than others, and frankly, much more productive from what they told me than they had been pre-pandemic, because they weren't spending time on other endeavors. As one student prompted me to add as well, the tenure system isn't necessarily equitable as is, so if we're rethinking legal education in this moment, maybe it's a good time to reconsider that as well. The big takeaway, though, for faculty is actually a little bit simpler than I expected, and that's honestly just to pay attention. So ask faculty for what they need. Some wanted teaching relief, others wanted fewer service duties or more RAs. Lots of people needed equipment or were frustrated that they had to pay for their own monitor or desk or whiteboard, especially because the university was recouping money because they couldn't use it for travel, for example. And so you couldn't really reallocate things and you were just spending a lot on your own. But really those who were the most satisfied are the ones who got the flexibility and the respect that they were seeking. So I think I'm just out of time, so I'll end by just noting that there are really serious implications for these disparities. In my survey data, a full 43% of law professors said that they have considered leaving legal academia in the past year. To me, that is a really shocking statistic. That's close to half of all of your professors who are saying, maybe I should stick around and maybe I can't do it. It's even more problematic when we recognize that vulnerable faculty, so again, women of color, caregivers, untenured professors, they are more heavily represented in that group. So I know that there were some students who asked about this directly. 2 of the faculty members from my study have, both of them from vulnerable populations, have left academia already. So it is a very real challenge, and one that has huge implications for the future. So what's the long-term trajectory for women who aren't able to publish for a year or two, right? The fact that this isn't happening for a year or two how does that affect your career? Whose voices are missing from legal scholarship if these vulnerable populations don't have the space or the time to write? And if our most vulnerable faculty members or students leave legal education, what does that mean for the future of our profession? Attrition is happening already, so we really do have to act fast to protect vulnerable students as well as faculty members. So, you're the future of the legal profession and of legal academia too, so I'm excited to share this data with you now and to talk with you more today, but also hopefully into the future about solutions, about ideas, about really how we can rethink legal education. So I'll stop here for now, and I'm happy to take questions however you want to arrange things. I'm happy to call on people or have you call on people, but thanks again for your time, for your attention, especially to the students for your response papers, and I look forward to our discussion. I know we can hear each other in the room, but the microphone is for the recording.
First of all, thank you for visiting us. We're very excited to have you and have this discussion with you. One question, I guess in terms of solutions, I wonder how feasible it would be, because one thing I think about, and I think a lot of students here do, is that during the pandemic, we all had our struggle, we had financial struggles, but we still saw a tuition increase. And I believe that's representative nationwide. So how feasible or a solution would be to give more direct aid to students from the institution? I don't know if that's something that you have been focusing on in your work.
Yeah, so one thing that's interesting with LESI is that we partner with schools to collect data from students. And so while we have national aggregate data on the student experience, we don't know what's happening at each individual school unless that school asks us for more individualized attention to figure out, what are some different challenges and how can we focus on solutions. I think even though it's not institution specific, which I know is the question that you asked, there are federal policies that might be useful here too. Tomorrow I'm participating in a day on the Hill to talk specifically with US representatives and senators, particularly about this topic. And so there are ways in which there has been support that's been offered in the past or new types of support to help relieve that burden, because you're right, it doesn't add up. I understand in terms of the institutions where they're coming from, a lot of the changes that were made did take a lot of financial investment as well. So like being able to move everything online, creating this new, types of content or I don't think it's Canvas. I know you guys have something here. Is it Blackboard? Yeah. So, if this is something that you didn't have before, then that's a new cost for the institution. And so I recognize that there are institutional challenges with doing that too. And this is part of why my suggestion is to think beyond only the financial rewards. Here, I think your question is specifically about, you say that students are struggling financially. How are we adding to that struggle, right? You didn't say it exactly this way, but I think that's the point, right? This is making it worse. And so, one other thing we can think about is how we can support students in ways, and faculty in ways that don't necessarily impart a huge cost on the university, but still have a huge benefit for the students who need those.
Is this on? Oh. So I wanted to say thank you for sharing your work with us. I think it was really validating to see a lot of the concerns that I had reflected back in an official report, which I didn't, I think we all knew the struggles we were facing, but to see that aggregated and kind of reflected back was, I think, really impactful. And I think my question then turns to, I think, the idea that while our country is kind of really eager to return back to like quote unquote normal, I think institutions are certainly not immune from that. And I feel like there's this race to get back to a quote unquote normal. And my fear is that that normal had, as you mentioned, all of these underlying stressors and faults. And how do we get institutions to not run back towards what was there before, or really to take this moment of the pandemic and say, like, okay, we do want to get back to a more, a less traumatic learning experience, but also take these lessons and actually implement them instead of just saying that was a bad time. These were the issues that we had and saw, but we've moved past that.
Yeah, thank you so much for asking that. I've thought a lot about the importance of helping people understand that even though we want to get past the pandemic, that we can't forget what we've endured because there are lingering effects. So for faculty members, not being able to write for a year or two might mean that you're not going to be a faculty member 2 years from now. So that is something I focused on a lot. What you're bringing up, I think, is related, but also really different and at least as important. We're trying to get back to some sense of normalcy. I think we all agree on that. That doesn't mean that we need to go backwards to the normal that we had before. And so what I've been doing is thinking about this, and I said this a couple times, even though I'm personally not one to necessarily search for silver linings in the pandemic. I've gone through too much loss and grief and heartache to feel like, oh, but there were good things too. I mean, if you can do it, I think that's fabulous. I can't do it. But what we can do is recognize the ways in which all of those challenges have set us up to think about how we can do better in the future. So that's what I'm trying to help more institutions recognize, that because we've taken this time to think about doing things differently, right? Whether it's moving courses online or doing externships in a completely different way than we've ever done them before. If we know now that we can do things differently, it's kind of an opening. What else can we change, right? What are the things that we know, just as you said, weren't working before? The things that were already broken, let's not move backwards to those things again. Let's use this as a chance to rethink those things so that we can create a, like you said, less traumatic normal, but something that feels more normal, more comfortable, but that addresses some of the fault lines that existed before the pandemic. It's also why I present this material the way that I do for you today, right? Where we're talking about what existed before. It's not like I painted a particularly rosy picture from 2019. But there are ways in which we can think about how we can improve. So if we are rethinking things now, let's use that to rethink not only the immediate essential things that have to be changed because of COVID, but to rethink some of the other big picture things that were hugely problematic before the pandemic too.
Hi, just to sort of follow on that thought, I was curious if you have seen or heard of any schools that are changing or are have started initiatives that you find like inspiring or positive, or role models that we can learn from, either with regard to faculty or students?
Yeah,
I don't know if it's too early, but if you had seen anything, I'd be interested.
I mean, I'm responding first to the very last thing you said, right? I don't know if it's too early. One thing we learned in the pandemic is that things can move really quickly if they need to. I don't think, for large research institutions, for example, there are very few things that probably need to move that quickly, but now we know it's possible, right? Things can really change within a day or two or a week for sure. So I don't think it's too soon to see those changes. And I am seeing some of those changes. So I've been invited twice over the past year and a half to join a meeting of all U.S. law school deans to make presentations about the results that you've seen today. So one of the meetings last year, I talked specifically about challenges with faculty, and then earlier this month, I met with the deans to talk specifically about the COVID report, the LESI report that many of you have read today and that I shared data on today as well. And so this time when I met with them, I took an opportunity to ask them questions as well about what they're doing, So you might be surprised to know, I was, that the vast majority of the deans who were there said that their schools have food pantries now. I'm not sure if 3 years ago they had them. I know that there are people who, especially once they read the findings in the report, who didn't have food pantries before, read the report. I mean, I've literally talked to deans who told me directly, I saw the challenges in your report, and we just set it up. It's not super complicated to set up. And so that was something that people did immediately once they recognized there was a need, not just a problem, but an actual need that they could solve. I mean, it is fantastic, I think, for someone who is in a position of power to be able to solve a problem, you know, like in a relatively simple way. And it doesn't mean that now food insecurity is gone and doesn't exist anymore. And that has been interesting for me to see as well. There have been individual faculty members at institutions who've reached out to me, for example, and said, my school has a food pantry, it's on main campus. Law students never go there. What can we do so that we can set one up here? What's the best type of food pantry to set up? And I talked with the deans about this as well earlier this month. Is it enough that it's on campus? Does it need to be always accessible? What does it mean if you have to sign up first to go? What if you need a key to go? Can you make requests for things that you want, right? So all of these are things that we can think about, not just to check the box, okay, food pantry, yes, no, but what can we do so that it's actually more useful? That's what we're trying to do, right? A food pantry that nobody ever uses, that's not actually solving a need. What are the ways in which we can make it more accessible so that it's actually meeting the needs of the students who want to be able to access that food? A similar one deals with mental health. So the vast majority of deans said that they have, and I asked this directly, free mental health services available on campus for students. Now, does that mean you get 3 sessions? 3 sessions a year, 3 sessions a semester? Are they free after 3? Is it fully paid after 3? Do you pay a portion? What's that portion? Right, so there are ways that we can think about how to do better instead of just thinking, you know, did I check the box or not? What can we do to meet the specific needs of our students? And every population is going to be different. There's not going to be one particular solution that's going to work for all schools. So, you know, what I'm doing with the LESI data, for example, because it's national aggregate data and it's released again to a national audience, is kind of hitting the main broad points, right? I can't really get into as many of the nuances and the details, but I'm hoping that when we first just encourage administrators to set up a food pantry, that then the next step is to talk about how can we make it as useful as possible, and then we can work together on that too.
Hi, I just want to echo thank you again for sharing this. I have a particular question about either the LESI data or maybe something that you found out from speaking with professors. Has there been any research showing that there's a distinction to the way that different class years reacted to the pandemic, either 1L, 2L, 3L, part-time, on the unique challenges that they faced during the pandemic?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. You know, one thing that we do every year when we collect the data, once we have all the data aggregated, we kind of run some checks just to see if it's accurate and valid data. And one way that we do that is we look to see, well, what did they, you know, nationally, what were the percentages last year? Because frankly, we would expect to see very little change year over year, right? Like students are not dramatically happier one year as compared to the year before. And so, you know, when I showed you that the findings on overall satisfaction rates, you could see that for 3 years prior, it didn't change within 1 percentage point, and then it's dropped now 3 percentage points in 1 year. That to us, I know that doesn't look huge, but to us that's dramatic, right? And that's COVID, obviously. And you know, maybe other things that are happening over the challenging past couple years we've had. So we did find that upper level students were more satisfied overall and had a better experience overall as compared to first year students. Now, first year students as a whole, you know, are often struggling and sort of getting acclimated to law school. There's not a lot of choice involved, you know, either in classes or in a lot of your other activities at school, whereas there's a lot more freedom that comes from staying in school, right? By your second year and your third year, there's a lot more choice. But in addition, you know, so many of the intangibles that I write about in the report are things that first-year students in spring 2021 had never had an opportunity to experience as law students, literally never, right? So one thing that, you know, I was really concerned about in terms of the future of the legal profession is how there was a dramatic drop in terms of the percentages of students who said that they had frequent conversations with people who were different from them. Not just different in terms of their race or their gender, but in terms of religion and background and other identity characteristics. And so if we're not talking to each other, except when I'm in the front of the room calling on, you know, 5 of you to answer a question, it doesn't really engage in the same way. Similarly, there was a drop between 2021 and years prior in students, not in terms of their engagement with coursework. So I think we figured out Zoom pretty well. You know, we managed breakout rooms and Socratic method online and finding ways to pair up students or, you know, have discussions. But they were very focused. And so all of those informal, you know, I hope when this talk is done, for example, that 3 of you come up immediately to like say something privately to me. I haven't done that now in 2 years, right? Because it's really hard to do that over Zoom. So the third-year students and some of the second-year students had done that already. They at least had an opportunity to know that they could do that. And some of them had created strong enough relationships that those could be translated to an online forum and stay strong. For first-year students, you know, it was just impossible. And same with, you know, I talked to faculty members, one faculty member, multiple faculty members, but one in particular who moved cross-country during the pandemic to start her first tenure track job. You know, she was in a brand new city with a toddler at a brand new school, one that she had basically never set foot on in terms of being on campus, hadn't met any student in person ever, right? And so it was much more difficult for first-year students to feel like they had that strong sense of belonging at their school, that they had a strong connection to their classmates, to faculty members, to staff. The staff drop-off, actually, in terms of positive relationships with staff and students, that was a dramatic decline. That's what we reported from 2021 in terms of how students were reporting on their interactions with staff is the lowest number that we've seen since we started collecting this data. And I think that's in part because we just didn't have an opportunity for students and staff to meet. I mean, at least I got to see my students, you know, in a little screen, but at least we could interact that way. I was forced to be there, you were forced to be there, and so we kind of had to talk to one another. And that made it easier then, I think, for a lot of students to come to office hours, because they knew that, well, I have to see her for 4 hours a week anyway, I'll just stop by to ask this other question. Whereas if it was a staff person who you'd never met, I think it was much more difficult for students to feel like it was worth reaching out. So those are some of the ways in which we saw really dramatic differences depending on the year that you are in school, and at least some of the reasons, I think, for why those differences existed. I know there's a question behind you and a couple questions in front of you as well.
I guess we'll pass this around.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask about online classes, to the extent that you can talk about it from your expertise and your data, because, you know, online class going involves a lot of compromises around cost, around acceptance by faculty and by students, around, for a lot of people, academic quality of classes. But it also has shown for some people to be a really important method of access and ways to deal with the pandemic as it continues to go on, as we go into whatever additional waves of it there will be. And so I was wondering if you could talk about what it seems like, what you think that we should do in regards to online learning the next time there is another event, COVID or otherwise, that pushes our ability to do class in person.
Yeah, so, you know, when I think about online education, it reminds me, for students, it reminds me of what I said about faculty members too, right? The number of faculty members who had been trying for years to be able to attend remotely a conference and who were told, well, there's no mechanism for doing that. And then lo and behold, right, we created a mechanism. And I will say that for a lot of faculty members, summer 2020 especially and into the fall was just excruciating in terms of figuring out ways to translate course material, even if it was a course they had taught before, to figure out how they could teach that online. It was really difficult for a lot of professors to do. So many people told me it was like a whole new prep. I knew the content, but the way in which I present it had to change dramatically. But now that's been done, right? Now we figured out how to do that. And so I don't know that we need to wait for another, pandemic quality event. Ideally, from my perspective, like you said, based on your expertise and the data, from my perspective, we would keep that available as a means to be more inclusive for students who could not otherwise participate. Now, I know that, again, there are ABA and other regulations that require in-person learning and require, people to take roll and a lot of other things. I didn't get a chance to talk about this today, but one of the things that really struck me in the faculty research is the number of professors who, were kind of disappointed that their institutions didn't create a system and so created a system on their own. So, my institution, for example, we've been a high flex model since the fall. We were online the entire year before, and now every single class is offered remotely and online. And that's continuing through the year, maybe until the fall, I don't know yet. And so, for my dean, I think she was very clear that due to COVID, students were going to be coming in and out, that they would be out for a week or longer at times, and that there would be overlaps. So there would always be a period of time where at least a couple students would be away, and where potentially the professor would similarly not be able to come to campus, whether she had COVID or she was quarantining or for other reasons. And so for my institution, it seemed from the administration's perspective like the best solution for the school at the time, given the information that we had then. There are a lot of schools that didn't create a system. There are some schools, for example, where the professors told me, the university campus just told us to figure it out, right? And so then they were kind of coming up with their own system. So I talked to a lot of professors who said, I'm recording all my classes and posting them online. I told my students directly, I'm not going to count it against you if you're not here. Officially, according to the ABA, schools are required to take roll, so we are supposed to say who's here. But they found creative workarounds around that too, right? Whether they said, if you watch the video later and tell me you watched the video, I'll mark you present. Or here's like a short, checklist or assignment to do so that I know you participated. That's going to count too. And so, as a sociologist, that makes me a little nervous because I like structural solutions. I want there to be one good thing that works for everyone, right? But I'm also really impressed individually with the ways in which people have figured out, okay, there are no structural solutions. No one is coming to save me, right? Let me figure out how can I make my class as safe and as accessible to as many students as possible. And so that has been really encouraging too. I think there are ways in which we might be able to continue some of that into the future, especially if we are rethinking legal education. I mean, there also, I'll just say, have been a lot more events in the last year with this kind of title, rethinking, reimagining, reinventing. These are new, right? And not that people weren't doing that before, but I'm participating in one next Friday, right? I don't remember if it's which of the re's it is, but it is rethinking, reimagining, or reinventing, right? It's one of those. And I think I've done 5 other ones. So hopefully that's happening and we can keep moving that forward.
So one of the things I've noticed about law school is that a great deal of effort is expended by students in the form of unpaid labor, whether that be through student groups that are putting on events and hosting spaces for other students, especially in the pandemic and with racial injustice, and through student-run journals. And that seems kind of juxtaposed with the problem that faculty are also overburdened. It seems like someone it has to pick up that labor, and it ends up being students in a lot of circumstances, but there's not a lot of space for faculty to otherwise take over that burden. What are your thoughts on how to kind of reconcile that?
Yeah, before I answer that, I'm wondering, because I know that when are we officially done?
In about 15 minutes.
Okay.
We'll go on to the classroom.
Okay, so I think we're good then, because I was going to say maybe we can take a group of questions, because I know there's maybe 4 or 5 other hands that I've seen, but I think we'll get to them if we have 15 minutes left. All right, so this is something that I don't talk about when I do presentations on LESI, but it's something I do talk about a lot when I'm invited to schools as a consultant to help work with them on issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. When I was a student, certainly, the student organizations that I was a part of were invited to call all prospective students from our, that we thought might be part of our affinity groups later on, and strongly encourage them to consider our law school. And our school knew that it was in our best interest to do that because, of course, we wanted more people from our background to be at our school. We wanted, a more diverse group of students overall to participate. And so, I think there are schools that do that still. But there has been certainly a shift to paying students for their time when they do that, to hiring students who are, literally listed as ambassadors or, some other formal title where they're given either a stipend for the year or where it counts as class credit because they have some other, assignments and work to do as schoolwork to do as part of that as well, where, it might not always be financial, but there is some recognition associated with the labor that you're doing so that it's not free labor, it's not fully uncompensated or unrecognized or unappreciated in that way. I mean, I'm sure it was appreciated even when I was doing it, 25 years ago, but there was no real reward. Even I felt rewarded when someone I called came to the school, but of course that's not enough. And that's literally, the same thing we're talking about with faculty members. I was talking with some students before the talk started today, and I was saying that in my book project research, I asked every faculty member who participated, what's the best thing about being a law professor? And so I didn't prompt them in any one direction, but the most common response I got, especially from women faculty members, white women and women of color alike, was something about students. The students are the best part of my job. The best thing about working as a law teacher is the interactions I have with students. Our students are the best thing about my school, right? Some version of that over and over again. So the problem is not doing the work. The problem is that when it comes time for tenure or promotion or contract renewal, service is, the least favored of the trifecta of scholarship, teaching, and service. It's just something that most people, overlook altogether. One of the participants in my study told me, my mentor told me directly, nobody doesn't get tenure because of service, right? So you do the absolute bare minimum, you just show up sometimes to the meetings you're required to go to, and you're still gonna, satisfy the service requirement. And yet we know that particular populations are doing 10 times that, right? That they're meeting with students who are crying in their office, helping students recognize, I tell my students directly, our admissions office doesn't make mistakes. If you're here, it's because we believe in you. We know that you can do it. Right? Because there are moments for all of us where we wonder, is this the right place for me? Am I going to be able to do it? And so, of course, that takes a lot of emotional labor too. And so when it's something that you're investing, even if you feel rewarded from doing it, and there are institutional benefits, it's nice when the institution recognizes that as well. So again, it's not something that I usually talk about when I make presentations on the LESI data, but it is something that comes up really frequently when I have these more private meetings with institutions as a consultant to help them recognize the ways in which, yes, students are happy to do it because they want their school to remain like a robust and vibrant, diverse intellectual community, but there are clear institutional benefits, and so they should be paying for that, one way or another as well.
Hello.
Okay. It's on.
Hi, thank you for coming and sharing your work with us. I kind of wanted to circle back to Julian's question earlier about tuition, and you reiterated a few times about how we should focus on, from my understanding, more cost-effective solutions rather than directly financial solutions to the needs of both faculty and students alike. But I was just wondering, or something that concerns me with that kind of approach is that if we don't focus on something that's financial, we're kind of taking away that agency that lower income students should have in choosing what to spend their money on. Because as much as I think a food pantry is a great idea, sometimes even just something so simple as to be able to be given some sort of stipend and not be told kind of like what it's supposed to be used for, because that's kind of like my business as a low-income student, and if I wanted to share that with my family, like that's my business. Or if I wanted to buy or like specifically organic vegetables, not just the ones that are offered in the food pantry. So I guess my concern is just how do we come up with things without coming up with solutions that are not removing the agency of lower income students or disabled students or other students who are special, just special in the situation. But I guess also being cost effective, because to me it seems like the most useful ones are to focus on financial. Like that just is plain kind of simple what it should be, in my opinion. But maybe you can help me.
Yeah, so when I was responding earlier, I thought that I was clear that the financial incentives are huge, right? To be able to provide that financial support is key, especially given the trade-offs between, our seeing, I think when I responded, I was maybe even a little bit more direct about it than the way in which you asked the question, because it is difficult, right? When the data show that students are struggling, and yet instead of supporting students, it feels like, tuition is increasing, and so if anything, the school is just making it harder, right? And I'm not saying you asked the question that way, but I sort of added that in, right? Because for me at least, that was sort of inferred, right? It's so obvious that students need more financial support, and yet we're making it harder for students who are already struggling financially. So it's not to suggest that that's not necessary, right? And that's part of why I talked about the federal programs and things that exist for students as well, because there are ways in which in the past there weren't as many assistance programs, not just loan forgiveness programs. If you're in the kind of, because again, this is the agency problem, right? If you're in the kind of work that the government decides is useful, then they'll be willing to support that with, tax dollars, with federal support. But even in terms of broader financial support systems that provide, emergency loans or stipends to students, I know a lot of schools receive those this year, that they were given to institutions as a whole that applied. I don't think that law schools individually applied unless it's a freestanding law school. Otherwise, it was an institution as a whole that applied, because one of the questions that I asked the deans, again at the Deans Forum earlier this month, was specifically about the ways in which they made broader resources available to law students, especially if they were getting resources from main campus. How did students know that those existed and were able to access those types of resources? And so I don't know what was available here. I don't know what the main campus applied for or what was made available to the law school, but I know that there were a lot of schools that participated in those broader financial incentives because they were getting a lot of support from the federal government as a whole. And the purpose of that support institutionally was so that it could be passed down, especially to students who are in need. So again, I don't know what the particular circumstances are here, but I certainly agree that finding other workarounds is not a substitute for the financial. My earlier response was that I don't know exactly what the specifics are here, but I know that there are ways that all of us can do better on the non-financial support mechanisms, which I think are really important for students as well.
Hi there. My name is Julie Dahlstrom. I'm an experiential faculty member here at BU, and I just want to say thank you. This is tremendously important work, and I'm just so excited that you're here. Is this on? Can you hear me? Okay, great. I wanted to ask you, it's not a lecture without talking about hierarchy and status. So I wanted to ask you about hierarchy and status within law teaching in legal institutions, and what you saw in your work. And you talked a little bit about interviewing either, I assume, junior tenure track faculty or untenured track faculty. So I'm curious what findings you had. I assume that there's you see disparities across different types of statuses, but also between them. And often institutions, it's really exciting, I think, are increasingly focusing on these hierarchy and thinking about how to address them. But sometimes the solutions are greater service to allow for more inclusion, or encouraging faculty who are not on the tenure track to write, which both of which is very important, but also maybe compounded in terms of thinking about some of the disparities that you talked about earlier. So I'd love to hear anything.
Thank you. So I'm trying to remember, because this is a slide that I added later. So from the faculty participants in the study, and I talked throughout the presentation today about different vulnerable populations. That's what I've been calling them. And that includes caregivers, untenured faculty, and women of color specifically, as well as other women. And so I didn't talk about the details of that. I talked a little bit about methods, I think, but not in detail. So for this project, I very intentionally included in untenured faculty members, both pre-tenure faculty and contract-based faculty. It's difficult to kind of make broad generalizations about different groups because, of course, there are. So that's why I talk about them all together as untenured faculty, because there are, for example, legal writing faculty at some institutions who are tenured. And then there are legal writing faculty members at those same institutions who are pre-tenure. And then there are legal writing faculty members at other institutions who are fully contract-based with no opportunity for tenure, right? And so it was difficult to compare. So I don't, in the essay, for example, that I shared with the dean's students, talk specifically about legal writing faculty as a group. I have, a number of legal writing faculty included in the survey, in the study, but some of them are tenured, some of them are pre-tenured, and some of them are not going to be tenured unless they move to a new institution or their own institution kind of revamps how they consider these hierarchies. And so I think, one thing that I don't know that this is what you're asking about, but it's prompting me to think about the ways in which there are potentially additional challenges, even for tenured faculty who have these different status positions. So you might be tenured in the clinic and still, maybe not have the same level of status. Even if you're producing scholarship, maybe people don't think your scholarship is as engaging or as doctrinal as the work that they're doing. I mean, honestly, for this, I'm in the final edits for this, the essay now, which has gone through a few different iterations from the one that I shared with the students. But, I have a footnote now that I've added where I try to parse out, in the essay I call them doctrinal faculty, but I hate that because, even the work that I do, right, it's about legal education, and many people think that's not a doctrine, and yet there's an entire, multiple bodies of scholarship on legal writing and on clinics and on academic support, right? And so, but I don't like podium faculty either. I mean, there are so many professors who have 50 people in class and they're wandering the aisles everywhere. They're not standing behind a podium, right? Or what does that mean about, when I teach my law and society class and we're all sitting at one table and sharing snacks, right? It's hard to find the terms, which, as I write in the essay, maybe that means if it's hard to distinguish, maybe there shouldn't be distinction. So for me, and what I write about in this particular paper and what I've written elsewhere is, if it's this difficult to sort of tease out and try to keep separate this distinction, maybe it's because there shouldn't be the distinction. And if we're thinking about ways in which we want to create greater equity in legal education, here's another opportunity, right? This is another example of things that, as one of the students said earlier, was maybe kind of broken before. How can we then move, while we're thinking about, reinventing, reimagining, all of this, this is another area, hierarchies and status, where I think we should be rethinking greater equity and access and inclusion.
Awesome. I think moderator is probably asking the last question. So thank you so much for this terrific talk and the slides. And I guess I want to ask kind of a nerdy question about the data.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just curious, can you slice and dice this data by region? I'm just sort of curious about whether there are regional distinctions, but also may overlay these various other findings that you've pulled up.
Yeah, so I certainly can. I can't, the thing, you know, when you have under, let's say, 500 participants, it's harder to disaggregate by multiple things. So this is why, for example, with the LESI data, I can disaggregate by race, but it gets harder to disaggregate by race and gender. So like, I'm not finding what I'm looking for. So, you know, if I talk about Native American students as a whole, for example, I have enough Native American students in the pool of LESI students so that I can say something about Native Americans as a whole. But then when I try to look at Native American women as compared to men, now I have half of each, right? And so my sample size is much smaller once I disaggregate. So if I just wanted to say, let's say, you know, how do schools in the South compare to schools on the West Coast? I can certainly say something about that. Or, you know, look at different regions as a whole. But I can't say necessarily what's happening with legal writing faculty members at a public school in the South. Right now, my numbers get way too small. But there certainly are, and this is part of why I was so purposeful with the sampling. I don't want to have one faculty member from the South only, right? What does that say then about this sample as a whole? Similarly, I don't want to have just one assistant professor, right? I need to have all of these broad categories well represented so that I can make meaningful comparisons, and so that the aggregate data, when I look at the whole data set, that it's broadly representative of faculty members as a whole.
Thank you very much. Please join me